All right, let's dive right into one of the absolute weirdest, most glossed over passages in the entire Bible. It's just a couple of verses in Genesis 6, and honestly, they sound more like they belong in a fantasy novel than in Scripture. But what if I told you that this bizarre little story isn't some strange outlier? What if it's actually the secret key to understanding the entire biblical narrative?
You got to remember where we are in the story here. We've had creation, the fall, Cain and Abel, and then bam, the Nephilim, the sons of God, heroes of old. It's a total record scratch moment. The text just drops these huge mythological sounding terms on us, raises about 1,000 questions, and then just keeps going. What are we even supposed to do with that?
And that's really the big question we're tackling today. See, most modern takes on this try to explain it away, to make it a bit more tame, a little more comfortable. But what happens if we don't do that? What if we take it at face value, the same way its ancient audience would have? What if this isn't a weird detour, but the starting point of a cosmic conspiracy that frames everything that comes after it? Let's dig in.
So, part 1, a biblical mystery. Now, while we might feel a little awkward about this verse today, you have to understand ancient writers thought this was a huge deal. And that right there is our first clue. We've got to get inside their heads to really get what's happening.
That's right. This whole idea that the sons of God were just, a respectable human family line, that's a much, much later interpretation. The guys who wrote books like 2 Peter and Jude and other Jewish writers from that time, they were crystal clear. To them, this was absolutely a story about a rebellion in the heavenly realm, where divine beings crossed a line they were never supposed to cross.
So, section 2 is the Mesopotamian connection. Where did they even get an idea like that? Well, to figure that out, we have to look outside the Bible, at the stories Israel's neighbors were telling. The first part of Genesis is basically a running conversation, and pretty often a running argument, with the massive cultures of Mesopotamia, like Babylon.
And when you put these stories side by side, the parallels are just shocking. The Babylonians had these myths about divine sages, they called them Apkalus, who existed before their version of the Great Flood. These beings, they mated with human women and had these quasi-divine giant children. Sound familiar? In fact, their greatest hero, Gilgamesh, was one of them. And just like the New Testament says, the evil Apkalus got banished to a dark underworld. I mean, come on, the parallels are impossible to ignore.
So was the author of Genesis just, copying their homework?
No way. This is a brilliant theological strategy called a polemic. And honestly, the best way to think of it is as a theological diss track. The writer is taking the Babylonians' most famous stories about their culture creating heroes, and he's flipping them completely upside down. He's saying, hey, you know those divine sages you worship? Yeah, they weren't heroes. They were rebels against the one true God, and their little project corrupted the entire world.
All right, part 3, who were the Nephilim? This brings us to the mysterious figures right at the heart of all this. Figuring out who or what they were is our next huge clue in this whole cosmic detective story. For centuries, people have argued about what this word even means. The most popular idea is that it comes from the Hebrew verb nephal, which means to fall. So they must be the fallen ones, right? Sounds pretty cool and dramatic, but there's a tiny linguistic detail in the original text that points to a totally different, and I think way more interesting answer.
And here it is, the linguistic smoking gun. So, step 1, you've got the common theory, fallen ones, from the Hebrew verb to fall. Makes sense. But, and this is a big but, look at step 2. The way the word is actually spelled in Hebrew has this extra letter in it, a yay. Now, for any Hebrew grammar nerds out there, that extra letter is a massive red flag. It just doesn't work if the root is to fall. So what gives? Well, step 3 solves the mystery. The word isn't originally Hebrew at all. It's an Aramaic loanword, Nephila, which simply means giant.
This is just so clever. The Jewish scribes who were living in Babylon at the time and spoke Aramaic deliberately chose an Aramaic word for giant. Why? To make their diss track impossible to miss. They were using the Babylonians' own language to call their celebrated half-divine heroes monstrous giants, the product of a cosmic crime.
So now we're moving from giants to Babel. Because the story doesn't end there, not by a long shot. The author of Genesis then leaves this trail of verbal breadcrumbs, connecting the pre-flood giant rebellion directly to another story of Mesopotamian rebellion you've probably heard of, the Tower of Babel.
Check this out. The author links these events by repeating very specific keywords. Back in Genesis 6, the Nephilim are called Gibborim, that means mighty warriors, and men of Shem, which means name or renown. Okay, now fast forward a few chapters. Who shows up? Nimrod, the founder of Babylon. And what's he called? A Gibbor. And what do the builders of Babel want to do? They want to make a Shem for themselves. See?
That is not a coincidence. That is intentional, brilliant storytelling.
So what you have to see is that these aren't just separate, random stories. It's one single, unfolding narrative of rebellion. It kicks off with a divine crime in Genesis 6. Then the flood comes and hits the reset button. But the same rebellious spirit just pops right back up after the flood, with Nimrod, a new Gibor, in Babylon. And it all climaxes at the Tower of Babel, where humanity once again tries to grab that divine renown for itself.
And that brings us to the last and, honestly, the most shocking part of this whole investigation. A world divided. This is where all the pieces finally click into place, and for me, it was absolutely mind-blowing. The judgment at Babel, it wasn't really about confusing the languages. That was just a symptom. The real consequence was way bigger, way more cosmic, and it sets the stage for the rest of the entire Bible.
Yeah, you can forget everything you thought you knew about the Tower of Babel. The real judgment, the real penalty, was an act of divine disinheritance. At Babel, God essentially fired the nations of the world. He just gave them up.
This verse, right here, from Deuteronomy, this is the key that unlocks the whole thing. And pay attention to that phrase, according to the number of the sons of God. For years, a lot of our English Bibles said, sons of Israel, which if you stop and think about it, makes zero sense because Israel didn't even exist yet. But then we discovered the Dead Sea Scrolls, our oldest manuscripts, and they confirmed the original reading was sons of God, the very same divine beings from Genesis 6.
This gives us what scholars call the Deuteronomy 32 worldview. At Babel, the Most High God divorces humanity. He disinherits the nations of the world, and he places each of them under the authority of one of these lesser divine beings, these sons of God. And then he creates a brand new nation for himself, completely from scratch, Israel. They become his personal portion, his own allotted inheritance.
Now, just let the implications of that sink in. First, the nations of the world are disinherited by God. Second, they're handed over to these other divine beings. Third, as we learn in places like Psalm 82, these new divine rulers become corrupt and evil. Fourth, God starts over by creating Israel to be his own special people. And the final, jaw-dropping result? This whole situation ignites a cosmic turf war for control of the entire planet.
And this totally reframes the entire Old Testament. The endless conflict between Israel and its neighbors? It's not just about politics and land. It's the visible manifestation of an invisible war in the heavens. All of a sudden, a story like Elijah on Mount Carmel isn't just one prophet versus 450 priests of Baal. It's Yahweh marching onto a rival god's turf and challenging his authority. It's a battle in the cosmic war.
And why does this matter? Because this worldview doesn't just fade away. When the Apostle Paul in the New Testament talks about warring against principalities, powers, and rulers of this darkness, he is tapping directly into this Old Testament framework of a world divided up among competing spiritual authorities. He sees his mission to the non-Jewish world as an act of cosmic reclamation.
So there you have it. We started with a super strange verse about giants that most people just skip right over. And by following the clues, through Mesopotamian myths, Hebrew linguistics, and these forgotten Bible verses, we've actually uncovered the origin story for the central conflict that runs all the way from Genesis to the New Testament. It's a conflict that defines the entire world of the Old Testament. And that leaves us with one final, massive question. If the world is a cosmic battlefield, divided up among warring divine powers, what happens when the Son of the Most High God himself steps onto that battlefield? Think about that.